Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Technological. Today, our guest is Kyle Woumn, currently the head of technology and part of the founding team at Overflow. In the episode today, we talked to Kyle about what it's like to get a software engineering job directly out of undergrad, and then what it's like to even take the leap of faith into entrepreneurship. So we talked to Kyle about his first company that he founded, the challenges he faced with COVID, and then starting his next company. Definitely like and subscribe, and shoot us a message if you enjoyed this episode. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Technological. Today, we have a special guest, Kyle, on the podcast. Kyle went to Georgia Tech with Anish and I. We spent a lot of time in the Culk going over data structures, trying to get through the DS and algorithms class and all the random classes we had to do. After school, Kyle moved out to San Francisco, and I'm gonna let him take it away from here and just talk about his experience. So, Kyle, if you could kick us off, just give us a high level background of what you've done, and then we'll just dive deeper into each segment.
Yeah, absolutely. What's up, everyone? My name is Kyle Woumn, originally from Atlanta, went to Georgia Tech with Avi and Anish, and studied computer science. And so while I was in school, I had various internships. So I interned at GE Energy Management in Salem, Virginia. It was a very interesting experience. And after that, I was like, I vowed that I want to be in the Bay Area and the heart of, tech in Silicon Valley. And so Georgia Tech has a career fair every year, every September. And September 2014, all the big companies are upstairs in the College of Computing at the career fair, and the startups are downstairs. So I'm like, let me try to do the startups, because the big companies just tell you to apply online. You spend an hour and a half, 2 hours in line, and they're like, apply online. I'm like, are you serious? You're missing class and everything. So I saw Twilio, and I didn't really know what they were. I looked them up on my phone. They weren't a world-renowned name as they are today at the time. And so I looked them up while I was in line, was able to finesse an interview, and then I interned there for 2 summers. And after I graduated Georgia Tech, December 2016, I worked at Twilio as a software engineer on the messaging team for about 3 years. And I've always had this knack for entrepreneurship, and I wanted to be an entrepreneur. So a friend of mine had this idea for a company called Shopper. And what it was is on-demand delivery for clothes. So think like Uber Eats, but for clothes. And it's pre-COVID, right? So this is December 2019 timeline. And during that time, say for example, you have an event coming up and you don't want to, or you're too busy, you're working, you're outside, when outside was open, you're doing all these things and you don't have time to actually get an outfit. And so what we would do is you say what you want, we would get an outfit for you. So it's kind of like Uber Eats, Instacart, but for clothes. Ultimately, the pandemic happened. We didn't have any funding. We could talk about that, funding and stuff later, but we didn't have any funding. So ultimately, I left Shopper, and we just kind of the company just fizzled. And I joined a company called Overflow as the head of technology. And what Overflow does is make it super easy for people to donate stock to nonprofits. So that's the high level, but I'm super excited to dive deeper into each of those segments and share.
Yeah, that's great. I can resonate with some of those statements, definitely around the entrepreneurial pieces, the software engineering work you did, and the late night Culk sessions, as I myself was a CS major too, grinding it out. But yeah, no, that's awesome. It sounds like a little bit of big company to start off with, then slowly sliding down to some startups.
Yep.
And then, flexing your entrepreneurial muscle in your latest endeavors. So I think, one topic that I think we like to dive into, especially for our listeners who are perhaps earlier on in their software engineering career, might be undergrads or trying to break into technology generally. As you kind of went to the career fair, and you were taking these classes, right? Data structures and algorithms, object-oriented programming, maybe even some higher level coursework. What was going through your mind? How did you kind of go about figuring out where to work or how to apply these things that you were learning in like
Yeah.
a company or a business environment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when I was looking, so like I said, my first internship was after my second year, and that was at GE. And getting that first internship is like always the hardest. It's like that paradox. It's like you need experience to get a job, but you need a job to get experience, right? And so, of course, there's like side projects and stuff like that. But that really wasn't me in college. I was very involved in like other like organizations like National Society of Black Engineers and a couple other things. So I didn't really have like, that experience. So when I was a freshman through NSBE, that's the acronym for National Society of Black Engineers, we would have different companies come, and one of them was GE, and I kept in touch with the recruiter. And I didn't get it that my freshman year, because I had just applied. I didn't apply too late, but all the spots were just already filled up. So I stayed in touch with her, and of course, like I was looking for other opportunities. I would like during the College of Computing career fair, all the big companies are there: Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Apple, all these companies you can name, they're there. Which I also realized not every school gets that. So I'm like, dang, it's dope that Georgia Tech has that. And so, I would go to those. I would apply online. I would stand in the lines. I would apply online, and I would actually sometimes I would do like they would have like a hacker rank, or there would be like a on-campus interview, and I would like bomb those, just because I bombed so many interviews. And it's just because like I started off, what I forgot to mention actually is I actually started off as computer engineering. I didn't switch to CS until my second semester of my second year at Georgia Tech. And so like I didn't really know, like I hadn't taken object-oriented programming, which is CS 1331 at Georgia Tech, hadn't taken data structures and algorithms. So I like bombed all those interviews. So GE was kind of like the only thing I had. So I'm like, you know what, I'll take it. It's a summer gig. I can get some experience, make some money. So I did that. It was like I said, in Salem, Virginia, very small town. And like the project I was working on, like GE is like this, huge, massive company, and I was just working on like this dashboard project that like really probably never even saw the light of day. And I was like, okay, so but I got the experience, I got something to put on my resume. And so once the career fair came back around, I really thought about it from a pure kind of strategy standpoint, like how can I optimize the number of companies I talk to at the career fair. And so that's why I kind of opted for startups. And then of course I heard about all these hot startups at the time, and like different hackathons, and a lot of the startups were like sponsoring these hackathons. I didn't go to them, but I would like hear about them. I had friends in like the startup scene, and I'm like, this sounds really fun. And so that's what kind of inspired me to want to go to do startups versus like big company. And so Twilio, like when I joined Twilio, they were probably like Series C company, but they weren't really known though. So they were like Series C, but they weren't like a huge like household name tech company.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And Twilio really grew, right? I think.
Yeah.
Were you there when they went public?
Yeah, so I was interning that summer. They went public. So I interned in 2015, and they were private still. And then 2016, they went public that summer.
Yeah. So we're curious to learn more about the interview process with Twilio. So we did an episode actually a couple episodes ago where we talked about like the interview process at Microsoft and like some of the bigger tech firms, but would love to shed some light, on interviews at like you said, like a Series C company and like some of these like private startups, and see if there's any differences there as well. So
yeah, so what the process was like with me, and like Twilio was still early on. They were like just now, or at the time they were just they had an internship program, but I think university recruiting for them, like their university recruiting department was just all over the place. So they told me they wanted to interview me. I did an on-campus interview, and it was at the Georgia Tech Hotel. Actually, they had like rented like a conference room in the Georgia Tech Conference Center Hotel, and I had the interview, and that interview was pretty straightforward. I want to say they asked me to like reverse a string or something like that. Pretty simple. At least in like now, I'm like, I could do that in my sleep. But at the time, it may have been difficult. And you have to think about what language you want to use. And generally, I would do it in Java because since I switched my major from computer engineering to CS, I didn't have to take the intro CS class, which is in Python. So I didn't even know Python. So everything I did, I interviewed in Java. And so they asked me that question. It was a piece of cake. And then they're like, okay, we want to move forward, but they never followed up with me. And so I had to like keep hunting them down. I had the the university recruiter's email, and I kept emailing her, and she was like, okay, we'll, set up an interview with someone on the team. And so then they did a phone screen with me. Like, this is like months later, but they did a phone screen with me. I'm glad I was persistent too. So they did the phone screen, and it was another kind of coding question. We were on CoderPad. So, they asked me the question, they can see me typing. And the question that the guy asked me, he was like the tech lead on the team. It was a question like, if you have, an array of integers, can you tell me like how many are duplicates? And so this is like, your standard like hash map, your hash map question. And so I was able to do that. And at the time, by this time I had taken, since they delayed the interview, it was actually great because I had already taken 1332, or I was in the middle of taking it. And so that was actually very helpful. So I did that interview, and then the last interview was one with the hiring manager. And I want to say he asked me another technical question. I don't quite remember, but that's kind of what it was. So it was like the on-campus interview and then 2 phone screens. But for full-time, what they usually do, and like when I was actually going for full-time roles, I had the offer from Twilio. They don't make you interview again, like after the internship, if you like done well, they will give you a return offer. But I wanted to, like, one, for negotiability, right? I wanted to get another offer, because that's the best way to negotiate, is when you have another offer. And so I had interviewed at Apple, and Apple, I did an on-site interview at Apple's campus, and it was like a series of like 4 interviews, and they asked some like really like technical questions, like dynamic programming questions. And I thought I bombed it, but I got an offer. But ultimately, I really liked Twilio. I liked how transparent the company was, and like with Apple, I find people in Apple, you can't really say what you're working on, and I didn't really like that. I loved like how transparent Twilio was, so that's why I ultimately decided it. But that's kind of like a lens into what that interview process looked like.
Yeah, that's great. Very helpful for illustrating that out, I think. And thanks for comparing it to Apple. I mean, just to kind of expand on that, and I don't know if there is much more to add, but maybe you do have some perspective on this. But like, do you think there's a difference between, in Twilio, you mentioned was I guess Series C at the time, so not like a 10-person, 50-person garage, startup, but they knew what they were doing, but not the size of like your beast of Apple, right?
Right.
Do you think there's any differences between how you would interview or approach an interview of a Apple or a Microsoft or a Google versus Twilio or other startups in that realm? And then I'm sure we can get into the small guys, especially now that you're taking on these entrepreneurial efforts, but we can approach that maybe later.
Yeah, so I was actually talking to a friend about this very recently. He had been interviewing, he worked at Uber, and he was interviewing with different companies, and he pretty much was saying, and I haven't interviewed in a while, to be completely honest, like me personally. I've like performed interviews for people, but I haven't actually interviewed. But the analogy he made, he was like, startups, they just really want to find people that can code and get to work. There's just so much to build. And then, with like bigger companies, they really want to see like how smart or how much and they really test you. And so I do find that, interviewing at startups is still like challenging, because, you still want to find quality people, and people that, can be, that can work fast, but also with quality. So it's like, kind of like, we need bodies on this, like, can we do it? Whereas with big companies, it's more so like, I find there's a lot more theory that they ask in those questions, or like it's more like, data structures and algorithms, like intense, not like the simple stuff, but more so like the more difficult things, like the difficult leak code questions.
Yeah, it definitely seems like at bigger companies, since they get so many applicants too, they just use these to like weed out people that, like, do you know have you taken CS classes? Do you understand, like you said, the theory behind like the CS?
Can you reverse a doubly linked list?
Yeah, exactly what you learn in like school, right? Like what you have to code for your projects. And then like startups, definitely a lot more on like the hacker side, where can you just put this together, get a product out and ship it?
Exactly.
So that's definitely like interesting to like hear about. So like I kind of want to also jump now into like your professional career and talk about, like your time at Twilio.
Yeah.
And just like learn more about that too, because you are still joining like a relatively like new company, right? Like even though
Oh yeah, we're seed stage. Yeah.
yeah, so like you joined at the seed, but then when you joined full time, you joined when they were like had just
Yeah,
IPO'd, right?
at Twilio.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, Twilio had just IPO. Yeah, the current company I'm at is a seed stage. But yeah, when I joined Twilio, they had just IPO'd. Yeah, full time.
Okay, yeah.
Full time. Yeah.
So still like very early in like,
Yeah.
like a company's like lifespan, right? So I'm
Oh
like
yeah.
really curious to hear, like how was it joining a company that had just IPO'd? You have all this momentum. So learning more about like the culture at Twilio when you were there, and then also diving into like what your day-to-day responsibilities were and like how you kind of grew as a software engineer as like at your time at Twilio.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was actually really exciting, like going to Twilio, Twilio being public. I remember when I first interned, it was definitely like one of those, work hard, play hard, like, fun stuff, happening, fun company. And it's still a fun company, but, as you go public and you become a public company, when it comes to like budget, the books are open now. And so, investors want their return. So there was definitely less, it became a little bit more corporate as time went on, but it was still a great experience. And there's still like, I feel like Twilio still has that kind of startup mentality. But when I was there, I was on the messaging team. And so for those that don't know what Twilio do, it's a cloud communications API. So they have one for messaging, one for voice, video. They have a whole bunch of products. They acquired SendGrid, the email company, as well as Segment, which is like the data platform. But what the messaging, so everyone has at this point has definitely interacted with Twilio, whether it's been those election text messages, people build on top of Twilio to communicate with their customers and their audience. And so I was on the messaging team and I was doing more front end work on the team. So we had a messaging console, and what the messaging console was where people, say for example, you're a company that uses Twilio, and say you have like an administrator, or even developers would use the console as well, but it's a place for you to see like your message logs. You can like configure certain settings, like, hey, I want to be able to send messages internationally. It was just like that place, and all this stuff could be done via an API, via the API, because Twilio was like one of these API first companies, but the messaging console was just kind of like that supplement. And so that's what I worked on. Essentially, I interned on the messaging team, and the team was really fun. And messaging at the time, I'm pretty sure it still is Twilio's #1 business unit when it comes to revenue. So that was like, really exciting to be on like the revenue generating product. And so while I was there, it was really different, especially coming from school, because in school, you have a project, and most times, especially in classes, it's kind of like cookie cutter. The parameters are set. But while, being a full-time software engineer, there's ambiguity, right? And you have to be able to, deal with that ambiguity and like solve these problems. And so there was that, also like working with production ready code. So, they taught us about tests in school, but like, when you're working on a project, you kind of just like manually test if it worked, but, automated testing was huge. And so, as I was like maturing as an engineer, the things I really needed to develop were like, having that ownership, right? And so at a certain point in time, I was actually the only person that worked on the specific service that I worked on. And so it was, from like planning to actually implementing. And so that was like really cool to see. And it's definitely helped me in my like current role. So that, and when I first joined Twilio, I actually had this guy that was the tech lead on my team. And I remember every time I would submit code and open up a pull request, he would just like tear my PR to shreds. It's like I kind of think about like the teacher that puts like all the red marks on your paper. That's how I felt. But it really like made me grow as a software engineer and allowed me to, write better code. And just even like reading his code was great. So that was kind of like my experience while there. And like some of the things that we shipped was like Twilio for WhatsApp. And so Twilio for WhatsApp. And so previously, before that, you can only send like SMS messages. But as we know, like outside of the US, especially, like so many people use WhatsApp and they have so many users. And so that was one of the projects, that I worked on while I was there that I'm like, really proud of.
That's awesome. And yeah, thanks for giving us, I think, a high level overview of what Twilio is.
Yeah.
It's a pretty, I mean, I guess at least for me and Avi and others who are reading up on these things, but it's become a slightly larger household name because it provides so much of that messaging and voice and communication very easily for developers, right? Or anyone trying to build an application with that use case. That's great. So do you mind like going into a little bit more detail around, you know, so maybe, you came in as a software engineer, right? And then
Yep.
ultimately got promoted up to software engineer too.
Yep.
So in your, entry level role as a software engineer, how much time, would you say, as you're working on this messaging component, was spent coding versus, potentially thinking through like, if you did this at all, like, technical architecture or, talking to users or dealing with bugs or, being in agile ceremonies or sprint grooming, right? Or
Yeah.
refinement, right? All of those things, like, do you mind just kind of maybe
Yeah.
structuring that and telling us a little bit more about those processes?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So generally what we would do is we would use Agile. So we would have 2-week sprints. We had a product manager and, we try to have the 2 pizza team as they call it. So it's about, I want to say like 8 people on the team. It's like the amount of people that can eat 2 pizzas. Like if you have more people than that, you want to split it. So that's kind of like the team. And so you'd have like a tech lead on the team, and sometimes they would split the teams to, front and back end. Sometimes the teams were based off of like the actual product, right? So and there was a lot of like team splits and like reorgs that happened. But what generally we would do sprint planning like on a Friday for the upcoming 2-week sprint, and then especially as a software engineer one, it was just me like working on just tickets, right, or a task on our sprint board. So like that was me. I was just essentially just coding all the time. So that was like me. And then as I was leveling up, my manager was like, in order to get to this next step, which would be software engineer 2, it requires like taking on ownership. So that's when I started like, and this is stuff I didn't really know coming out of school. So that's when it started coming like creating design documents and about when it comes to like technical architecture, like implementing and designing that stuff. So that's what, as I progressed from software engineer, like the later stages of me being a software engineer one, is when I started like doing more of those things and, being able to present to the team like why we should use a certain technology or do something a certain way versus the other way. So that was actually really useful. And it really made me like the subject matter expert, especially as like people would come to my team, leave my team. Like I said, at one point I was like the only person working on it. And so I really had like a depth of knowledge of like what I was working on. And so whenever people had questions, like I was the guy. And so that was that was really valuable. And that was actually one of those things that I think boosted me in my career. And that's something that mentors have told me too, like becoming the subject matter expert. But one thing I never wanted to do was just get pigeonholed into that one thing though. I feel like that's also like a career risk as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, it's such a balance, right? With figuring out like I really want to dive deep into this one area and get good at this one thing, but this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. So how
Yeah.
do you kind of like balance the two and make sure like, okay, I'm going to grow my career, but I want to stay general enough where I don't get stuck in one area.
Yeah,
So I
exactly.
think that's
Exactly.
really important. And I think that's really important for like a lot of our listeners too, is like, yes, like you'll be working on like a specific product or function when you first start, but get really good at it and you can still grow after that. Just don't worry that you're just going to get pigeonholed in that one area because you're just starting off your career and you have so much of your career left, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's also like a good segue point for us to kind of talk about your entrepreneurial itch and what pushed you to start Shopper, and just kind of walk us through like your mindset when you were starting Shopper and then maybe like leaving Twilio where you're doing it at the same time, and how you thought about taking that risk, right? Because it is like you're going from stable income to like not so stable income. You're building a product from the ground up. So just would love just take us from like the ground level, like your thought process and how you did it.
Yeah. So there was a time where like pretty much when I was at Twilio, I felt that I was plateauing. I could have switched teams, and like this kind of goes back to the previous question. Like I feel like I knew everything I needed to know, and like the work I was doing was just very easy to do. I wasn't like stimulated or like challenged. And so of course I could have switched teams or done other stuff, but I've always wanted to do entrepreneurship. And I knew if I switched teams, there's always that like that ramp up period, right, where you have to like learn the new, whatever the team they're working on, learn their services, their code base. And I was like, that's going to be a lot. And I always wanted to do entrepreneurship. And so I was thinking about what my next thing was, but I didn't really like, I'm like, when do I jump? Right. That's the big question. It's like, when do you jump? And I've always wanted to do it. And I'm like, if not now, then when? But before I did it, like I had a friend, she's actually from Atlanta, but we met in the Bay Area. And she was telling me about this idea of pretty much Shopper, her and her college roommate, they went to Clayton State University. And they had this idea for Shopper. And they would hit me up all the time about technical questions, like how can I scrape all these listings off of, a website. And so I would like help them on the side just for fun. And then she's like, we're going to apply to YC and which is Y Combinator, one of the most renowned accelerators that, a lot of big companies like Dropbox, Airbnb went through. But she was like, we're going to apply to YC and do all of this. And I was just, getting really excited. And she was like, I'm applying to YC like coming up. And I know what Y Combinator, they want all the founders to be full-time. And so she was full-time at the time. I'm working on it. And I was like, okay, I think this is actually a really cool idea. This is something I could commit to. So practically what I did was I waited until the next vest, which was stock vest essentially, because with Twilio, you vest quarterly. I know at some companies after the 1 year cliff, you vest monthly, but with Twilio, you vest quarterly. So I'm like, let me not be stupid here, especially when we, didn't have funding and stuff like that. So we ultimately applied to Y Combinator. We got an interview, which was actually really cool. And like, this is pre-COVID. So we got to go down to the Y Combinator office in Mountain View. And we actually interviewed, and it's a 10-minute interview. It goes by really fast. They ask you like all these different questions. It's like four of them, like four of the partners at YC. And it was like our team, the three of us. And it was just like, they just essentially are trying to find all the loopholes in your business, or not find all the loopholes, but they want to see what your business is, right? Is this a sustainable business? And, they really want to know like the why, like, why do you think this is a business? Because YC's motto is like, build something that people want. And so they're like, how do you know? Because originally when we had Shopper, we were like, get these items in less than 2 hours. And one thing that Michael Seibel, who's the CEO of Y Combinator, he was one of our interviewers. He was like, how do you know people want this in 2 hours? Like, how do you know? And what they really wanted to hear was like, customer, like that you've talked to customers or potential customers and that they, want to do this. So ultimately we didn't get into YC, which was a huge bummer for us. But, going forward, we were just like, all right, we're going to still work on this. But as we're working on this, one of the co-founders was like, hey, because she had been working on it full time for some time, like a few months at this point. And she was like, hey, since we didn't get the YC funding, she was just like, I just got a job. And I was just like, oh man, that was kind of like, because the plan was that we would all be full time. And I was actually about to put in my notice at Twilio, but I'm like, okay. But she was like, we can still work on this. I'm like, okay. And so I'm like, I planned on going full time just because I felt like I had reached the end of my time at Twilio. So I'm like, I still think this is a big idea and this could be something big. And so I ultimately put in my notice to Twilio like right after Thanksgiving 2019. And I ended up staying like instead of like 2 weeks, I ended up staying like a month for like transitioning and stuff like that. So my last day I remember was December 19th, 2019. And that's kind of like when I started working on Shopper full time. And so like we would meet, we would have like what we would do, like to essentially test out the idea of Shopper. We created a landing page, which was pretty much just, it will take you to a type form and it'll ask you different questions. And it'll be like, hey, what items do you want to get? And we would pretty much send it to our friends to have them try it out. And we were the ones actually going to the mall to get it. And here's some context here. I don't have a car in San Francisco. And so so sometimes it was like my co-founder, they would go get the stuff because like they had cars, or it would be me like riding BART, which is like the public transit, like to a mall whenever like someone wants something. But we found that like, that wasn't really sustainable. So this is like probably like January, February pre-COVID. And then we switched the model. We were like, okay, what's another problem? Because we felt like the on-demand thing wasn't a huge issue for people at that time. And I think it still could be, I still think it's a big opportunity. But what we ended up switching to was this whole try before you buy model, because we were like, okay, returns is big. Returns is where, people, they'll buy something and either they're just too lazy to return it, and then, the window, the 30 days, 60 day, however long it is, that window ends, and then, they're out of their money, or they do return it, but stores are so slow, you don't get your money back until a month later. And so we were like, what if we could try this whole like try before you buy business model, where people would tell us the items that they want to purchase, and then they don't have to pay for it up front. We would essentially float it for them, and then they can try it. We would like ship it to them, and then they could try it on within like a day or however many, I think like 1 to 2 days, because you don't want people to wear the clothes out like a night out to the club and then try to return it. But if they wanted to keep it, they could keep it, but otherwise they would so the way the business model worked is they would pay us like a fee, and we were just starting off to test it. We would say $5. This try before you buy. This is like non-refundable, but this is the deposit that assures you that we would float the clothes for you. You can try them on, and if you want to return them, you're not out of your money, right? You didn't have to pay anything but that $5. But if you want to keep it, it's like, great, the clothes fit, cool, but we still made the $5. So that was the business model. So we tried that out with a few people, but then COVID hit, and people were getting laid off, and it was just a really hard time. And so ultimately we decided that this wasn't a good time to pursue Shopper, because like people at the time weren't spending money on clothes and stuff like that. And so we shut it down. But during that time, I actually was part of a program called On Deck. I'm not sure if y'all have heard of it, but it's a fellowship program for founders. They've actually expanded it. They have like multiple fellowships now. They have like a no code fellowship. They have a angel investor fellowship, but I was doing their founder fellowship. A guy that I met he was like a pastor at a church that I went to in SF. He told me about this fellowship because he did it in On Deck. He was in On Deck's cohort before me. So he was in On Deck's second cohort, and I was in their third. And so midway through it, he was working on Overflow. And so so I was working on Shopper at the time. He was working on Overflow, and he was interviewing for YC, and he reached out to get kind of like some tips on the interview. So I gave him some tips, and then ultimately he didn't get into YC. We reconnected, and at this time I had left Shopper. So this is like April timeframe. And when I left Shopper, go ahead.
I know you're like on a roll, but I just want to kind of bring it back to like Shopper itself. So like after you left Twilio and joined Shopper full time, and you like, unfortunately YC didn't work out, were you guys pursuing fundraising at that time too for Shopper, or was it kind of just like you made that jump and just like, I have enough cash burn right now to kind of like ride it out until I feel that we need to like raise a round, or like probably like a seed or angel round? I'm just curious, like were you guys like, how were you guys funding the business at that time? And
at that time it was literally personal, out of our pockets. And so like, with that last vest, I essentially cashed it out. I was like, this is gonna be my living expenses for the year. And it was $50,000. I'm like, this is gonna be my living expenses for the year. Especially, and that was gonna be a frugal lifestyle too, because rent in the Bay Area is crazy. So that was gonna be a frugal lifestyle, and we wanted to look for funding. So we're looking at different accelerators, applying to different accelerators. So we were doing that, but then like this is like right when COVID hit, and so right when COVID hit, things just kind of paused. And like one of the co-founders, she wanted to take a step back, and I was just like, I can't do this by myself. It just would have been a lot of work. And I didn't think that we were the right team to do it, but we were pursuing funding. So after YC, we were still trying to like pursue funding, find accelerators, but ultimately we didn't get anything. We didn't apply to a whole lot of things, and especially with accelerators, it's one of those things where it's seasonal, right? So applications are open at a certain time, they close at a certain time. So you have to be at the right time when you're applying. And the other approach we could have taken was like angel investors, but like I really didn't know a lot of like people like in my network. Now I know quite a few angel investors, but at the time I didn't really know, angel investors that would like, personally invest their own money into this endeavor. So at the time it was just like us out of our own pocket.
Bootstrapping is the way to go, I guess, if you can. For only so long though. But it's awesome. It sounds like leaving Twilio was a combination of you feeling like you needed to kind of just get stimulated again, wanted to kind of jump into something new, and a combination of that right, entrepreneurial itch, and it sounded like a cool problem to work on.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And I think, yeah, let's continue on with that story of then how you got into Overflow and how COVID kind of impacted
Yeah.
the market research and user validation you guys were doing over at Shopper.
Yeah, so yeah, that pretty much, yeah, that happened. COVID happened, and then one of the founders, the job that she had gotten was a contract job, and so it had ended right before, right when COVID hit, and then she was looking for other opportunities. She was like, I just need to take a step back, and I totally respect it. It was it was definitely in the moment an unfortunate blow. I'm like, dang, like I'm really, I'm 2 feet in, right? I wasn't like 1 foot in and 1 foot out. I was 2 feet in, and so that was a really tough situation. And so I gave myself kind of like a timeline to where we should have at least, this is like a personal thing I had set up for myself. I was like, by April, I think it was originally March, but then I expanded it to April when COVID happened. And I was like, I'm going to give myself this much time to see if we can at least get some initial traction, right? And if we can't, then I have to step away from it, just because like I was using my personal money, and I was like, if everyone's not all in on this, then I can't be all in on this. So ultimately I walked away around April timeframe, and I didn't have anything lined up at the time either. I was thinking like, do I want to do like some freelance work on the side? Do I want to go back to Twilio? My pride wouldn't let me, but I was like, do I want to go back to Twilio? All these things. And Twilio is a great company. And then, seeing, especially later, like in 2020, seeing Twilio stock soar during the pandemic, I was just like, oh man, like tripled from the time I left. I'm like, did I make the right decision? And so I was just like thinking, I took a few weeks off, just like, what do I want to do next? And that's when Vance and I reconnected. So he had, referred me to this on deck fellowship. He was in the cohort before me, and he was interviewing for YC. So I was like giving him some tips, and then ultimately he didn't get in, and he said, he really needed a technical like partner, like head of technology or like kind of co-founder level. But he had been doing it for some time already, and he had already de-risked the business. He had already had like 5 hires, like 2 engineers, a sales, pretty much a business development representative. And he had raised a bit of angel money, about 600K in angel money. And so he was just like, hey, I need like a technical partner. I think you'll be a great fit. And I've like worked with him in the past, like not in like an actual work capacity, but like through church and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, like he's a great leader. He's driven, and that's kind of like how he had the idea for Overflow. And so what Overflow is a like I said earlier, well, in my intro, we make it super easy for nonprofits to receive stock donations and for people to give stock donations. So if you want to donate stock like today, the way it works is there's like, you have to go and get like this paper form and fill out this stuff. You have to ask the nonprofit you're giving to their DTC number and their account number. DTC number is kind of like a routing number if we make the parallels to checking accounts. And then you have to either fax or mail that document to the brokerage. And like, I'm like, wow, it's 2021, or it's at the time it was 2020. That's very antiquated. And so at the church Vibe, they actually have they're based in Palo Alto. They have what's called a vision gala every November. And a bunch of people that go to the church are in tech. They work at like Tesla, Facebook. And what they wanted to give stock, because donating stock is actually one of the most tax efficient way to give, because you're able to, 1, offset capital gains tax. And then 2, when you're giving stock, it's generally people give more when they're giving stock. And so you're able to get, a higher tax deduction. And so that was the idea. And one of the years I actually cashed out Twilio stock to give. And that was really bad, because when I cashed out the stock, I was subject to capital gains tax. Whereas if you give the stock in kind, just transfer the stock, you don't actually have, capital gains tax, and the organization actually makes more money because it's not the money less the taxes. And so he had the idea for Overflow. He had been working on it, and I thought it was a cool idea, especially since I had actually experienced it before. And so I joined the team back in May. I was like the 6th person on the team. I joined as the head of technology, and at the time we had like we had a working product, but we've definitely like refined it a lot more since then. And so now so I guess the business model, I don't think I've mentioned that either. The way it works is the nonprofits are actually our customers. So the nonprofits today, because it's a lot of work on their end too, and they have to do something called a charitable acknowledgement letter. And so what that means is whenever someone gives, they have to like send them a letter saying this person gave. So when the person files their taxes, they can like provide all that information to like their CPA. So pretty much with Overflow, we provide like all the back office stuff for the nonprofits to do that, and we make it like we have like a really cool UI that lets the donors give. So that I'll stop there, and I don't want to like keep going, but I'll let you all ask.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds. I didn't even know you could give stock as donation. Frankly,
Yeah,
like,
a lot of people don't know that.
I
Yeah.
had no idea. Just so I can understand the product a little better, it's like the nonprofits use your backend function, and that way they can receive the stock from the user.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, go
is it
ahead.
gonna like APIs that you're building for the nonprofit itself, or?
Yeah. So right now it's simply a button, right? And so it's like a PayPal button, but we call it's the Overflow button. And so what they would do is embed it on their website. We send them like the little HTML tag to embed on their website, and it takes them to their own custom Overflow page. And so what if I'm a donor and I'm on their website and they see, oh, donate stock with Overflow? Because previously it'll say, reach out if you're interested in donating stock. Reach out to Red Cross at stock gifts or stock gifts at redcross.org. And it's like, oh, and then it's like this whole back and forth process. And so with us, we have like this give stock through Overflow button, and a donor would just click the button. It goes to that nonprofit's branded Overflow page. And then the donor just goes through in a few steps, and they connect their brokerage. We use Plaid to connect the brokerage account, and they see their securities that they want to give. They select it, they sign, and then from there we've automated it so that the transfer happens.
Oh wow, that's super simplified.
Yeah,
Made
exactly.
it so much easier than like having to fax some document over and deal with all like paper and
yeah,
all
so
the
much
ongoing
friction,
process.
man.
Yeah. So I'm really curious to hear, number one, what your role is as like the head of technology, and number two, this might be kind of like a naive question, but does that mean you're like the CTO? Like, is that kind of like, okay?
Yeah. So it is CTO. I think everyone at the company or at like the, I guess, exec level, so to speak, is like head of, but yeah, it's essentially like analogous to a CTO role. And so my day to day, I know when I first started, it was a lot of like, in the weeds coding, and still like, even this week I was working on some like feature, right? Like personally coding, but a lot of it, especially as we're growing, bringing on more engineers, my role has to become more strategic. And so doing the things that only I can do. So when it comes to like compliance, right, getting all that stuff taken care of, planning, design, all these like kind of like strategic high level things. Hiring is a big thing, right? And when it comes to startups, like hiring is, especially at the seed stage, like we're a seed stage startup, so hiring is actually kind of hard, because like like no one really knows who you are, and they have to really believe in the company. So those are kind of the things that I'm like starting to shift towards and focus on, as opposed to like the day-to-day like actually coding and stuff like that, because I feel like my time is best leveraged when I'm doing like these higher level things.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just to add on to that, again, maybe to go into one of your points you just mentioned,
Yeah.
two things. So one, how would you compare the sort of individual contributor role you might have played over at Twilio? And then, of course, I think at Shopper, you guys are probably still in that validation phase on the
Yep.
user research side. But how would you compare Twilio as a technical contributor to now being, by name the CTO or head of technology, but also doing all of these other really important tasks to help get the business off the ground? And then second question would be, you just mentioned hiring, obviously a huge part of building out a company. Like, what are some things you kind of look for in potential candidates, and how do someone's a good fit for the company?
Yeah, No, awesome. Great question. So the first question is like kind of like the comparison of roles. So yeah, I was an individual contributor at Twilio. So for me, like, it was mainly just, we have sprint planning. I do my tickets, or if we were working on a new product or a new project, being part of like the planning process. So I really enjoyed that, and like I know my managers and like the tech leads when I was at Twilio, I always notice, and this is like, when we're in person. So I'll be at my desk and like everyone's gone and it's like, oh, they're in like a planning meeting, right? And so I was shielded from those meetings. But now, especially being as like, head of technology at Overflow, a lot of my time are in those meetings, like, planning and stuff like that. And I really try to shield the engineering team from those meetings. Like the only meetings we really have are like, our planning meetings. We do everything else async, especially now, but we do like stand-ups through Slack, right? Because I'm like, people don't need to, that doesn't need to be synchronous. So yeah, a lot of my time now is definitely spent, being those people like at Twilio, like always in the meetings and stuff like that. But I find when it comes to like developer productivity, like, being able to shield them from those meetings is great. And just being able like to disseminate the information. But yeah, it's really interesting because I've learned like a lot of the stuff I did at Twilio, like the practices where like, a lot of the best practices I've brought over to Overflow. So when it comes to like, pull request etiquette and, just trying to groom us to, although we're a startup, we want to be a mature startup, right? We want to eventually, be Series A and just become a bigger company. So those are kind of like the things that I definitely say were valuable. And I'm glad that I had that experience at Twilio, because I think had I not worked in the industry and I just went straight startup. I know there's a lot of people that graduate college, they just do a startup, and I think just seeing how business works was really helpful for me. And so that's really applicable here. And then when it comes to hiring, some of the things that I really think about is can like it's still like the standard, like can you code. We do a interview process, and then we have you meet with like our head of operations, who does like kind of like the culture interview, just to see would you be a good fit essentially with the company. And what we look for when we hire is like can you code. Also, like we want to be able to, we want to build like a humble company. Kind of like, I know some people, especially working at bigger companies, coming to a startup, there may be a lot of a big ego, right? And so we don't want egos like within the company, because we think that can just really drive down like the company culture and then like the company itself. And so we really look for like that humility in people, and people who kind of just have like, I guess, there's a lot of people that want to do good in the world. So it's really cool, like to find software engineers that have a passion for like helping other people and, not helping nonprofits and stuff like that. So those are kind of the things we look for. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Some really good points there, especially around like building to scale and like setting out like good standardization and good practices for your company itself. So like when you actually do get like lots and lots of traction, your code base is able to actually handle all of that, right?
Yeah.
You're not like just hacking away, like plugging in like random like holes. Because it's interesting. I was in consulting, and you see like the way they've done a lot of their like database migrations and like how they're going through all of it, and like seeing some of the code behind it and like the data. It's just it's such a mess, right? So you really want to build like a scalable company. And then the other point I think that you made that was really good was like kind of starting at a bigger company and learning business itself, like learning, because they've already done it. They've done like all the trial and error. So you might as well take their practices and apply it to, your startup and what you do. And I think what you said was really right. It's like a lot of people want to go out and they just want to start a startup and like, like live that lifestyle. But it's really important to like train yourself, and like these big companies that are essentially like a big training ground.
Yep,
So
exactly.
I think that's really important. I did have like one question really quickly. So this is a debate that we're having in our group chat right now. It's kind of between like Anish and Sarin, who unfortunately couldn't join today, but they're kind of arguing about passion from like the engineering side, especially starting at like an early stage company. So Sarin's making the argument that a lot of hiring managers, when they're looking at software engineers joining earlier stage companies, they should be like really passionate about the mission and the drive of the company. And then Anish's not saying they shouldn't be passionate, but he's saying it's more like, can they get the job done? Can they like do the work? So I would love to hear just, from your point of view, being at like an early stage company, what you're thinking about this. Because I think it's funny because they're having a debate. So I was like, let's settle this right now.
But let me add a little bit of clarity here for you, Kyle. I also want to distinguish between, the size of the company and what companies start to look for, right? Like at a seed stage company, right? I think the culture and the problem that you guys are focused on and helping these nonprofits, if somebody isn't, passionate about it, that can be infectious, right? And that can be very detrimental to the company. Whereas, and this is my theory, but later down the road for Series B, Series C, whatever Series D company, once they found product market fit, they've been able to prove that they can scale, as you kind of hire technical talent versus non-technical talent, meaning, sales and marketing or customer facing teams, et cetera, versus engineering, technical people, you might be less focused on that sort of, how much do they care about the mission and the company, which, ideally you want to find anybody that does, but you're more concerned with, how good are they at, how's their software development skills, or how's their ability to use different technologies versus that. So yeah, I mean, you'd love to hear your opinion and yeah.
I feel like at early stage, especially like where we are, every single person on the team makes a big impact. So right now we're like a team of like 14 people now, but every single person, like every key hire, like, essentially there's no room for dead weight. So everyone has to like, pull their weight. Everyone's critical. I feel like at, bigger companies, there's definitely those people that like, as they call it, rest, invest. And so at smaller companies, everyone's like putting in the work. So especially at our stage, it's something that I feel like, because one, we're still kind of like proving out, our business and stuff like that. And so if you're going to be like spending a lot of hours working on something, I feel like there has to be, at least a bit of passion. You don't have to be like, oh my gosh, it's like the best thing ever. I feel like, especially if you had just heard of a company and you're interviewing, right? You don't really know much about it. I feel like that passion comes as you continue to build and you like see the company flourish. But I think, for us, so it is good, like for people that, really so I don't want to use the word passion, but people that align with our mission, right? I think that's a better way to phrase it. Like, people that align with our mission, that, think what we're doing is cool. I like that. You don't have to be, passionate about it, but at least, have, a lot of interest in like, you like, I can rock with this. And so I do think that that's important. But then also, of course, the bigger thing at a startup, you're trying to live to see another day. You don't want to run out of money. And so we definitely want to find someone that can get the job done. But I agree that at bigger companies, at a certain point, it's not so much about passion. It's more so about like, can this person get the job done? But I do think that passion or alignment is very important at the earlier stages.
Awesome. No, that was a great answer. And we're definitely going to go back to Saran and let him know what you said. So thanks for it. So I think we're definitely reaching the top of the hour and we don't want to hold you too long, but just, do you have any closing thoughts or, final advice for like people looking to go into software engineering, as well as people looking to pursue, their own business and make that jump into entrepreneurship? So yeah, I would just love to get your like final thoughts on it. So.
Yeah, I would say my advice for people looking to, do software engineering would be just to, I think the name of the game is practice, right? Especially when it comes to interviewing and landing these big jobs, right? Whether it be like the big tech companies or startups, I would say practice is a big thing. Like I said, I bombed so many interviews, but it was just like, the repetition, as well as, me continuing to study, challenge myself, do mock interviews. That was really helpful. So that would be one of my kind of words of advice for people wanting to go into software engineering. And then for people who are looking to do startups, at least, and I'll talk about people that are looking to found startups, and especially people that are looking to work at startups. I would say if you want to found a startup, one thing I think you have to have deep conviction in what you're doing, right? Building startups, and I was naive too when I first left Twilio to like go into this. I didn't think building a startup was actually this hard, but it's actually, you know, a lot of work when it comes to, you know, you have to sell, right? You have to get the money somehow, but you also have to be able to build a solid product. And there's just like so much that goes into it. So whatever if you're like thinking about pursuing an idea, make sure it's something that, you know, you're deeply convicted about. And I don't think I had that deep conviction about Shopper. So I would, that's something. And then for people that are looking to work at startups, I would say, like, you know, there's so many startups out there, and startups are always looking to hire solid people, but make sure you find a startup that kind of like aligns with you, aligns with your values, and something that you can see actually, like, you know, growing, and there's like a need in the market. So that's kind of like my advice for the day.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think especially for those that are you know, trying to potentially take that leap from, you know, maybe a bigger company to a startup, or to take on that entrepreneurial role. And I think you kind of alluded to it, right? And I think the term is called maybe entrepreneur market fit, or entrepreneur
Yeah, founder
problem
market
fit.
fit. Yeah, I've heard. Yeah,
Founder
yeah.
market fit, exactly. And I believe it's the idea that, you know, it's a problem that you care so deeply about, that you're so interested in wanting to set out and solve. And that's when you say, okay, well, I'm going to go and, you know, work on trying to come up with a solution to this problem. And that's why, you know, a lot of entrepreneurs seemingly succeed, because they are so deeply invested in that space. But yeah, I think just to kind of close things out, this was great. We really enjoyed you kind of coming on here and talking about your vast experience from big company to small, but now big company, and then your entrepreneurial journeys. And if, you know, if you're hiring, of course, we can share the link to your company. And yeah, we'd love to dive in potentially at another point later down the road as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for having me. It was super dope chatting with you, Avi and Anish. So thanks for having me.